right? Find new episodes of Sick Boy each week on CBC Listen or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is a CBC podcast.
For the record, you are guilty of killing many women and girls.
Yes. Yes, that's true.
Ted, how did it happen? How did this moment come about?
I'm Nala Ayed, and this is Ideas.
That's the question of the hour, and one that not only people much more intelligent than I have been working on for years, but one that I've been working on for years and trying to understand.
On average, a serial killer will commit his first murder around the age of 27, 28.
This is filmmaker and historian Peter Vronsky.
That's the statistical average. However, their fantasies begin to develop as early as the age of 5, 6, and 7.
Peter Vronsky writes and speaks on the history of serial killers.
At its peak in New York, there were 2,500 murders a year. Every day, there was murder. And so there was this kind of violent electricity to the city as well.
His most recent book is called Sons of Cain, a history of serial killers from the Stone Age to the present. In November 2019, Peter Vronsky gave a talk at Ryerson University in Toronto where he teaches about the astonishing way he first got interested in the phenomenon.
I was filming punk rock bands coming down to New York in 1977 playing CBGBs. That was kind of my first exposure to street life in New York, and it was a bit of an adventure for a Toronto boy. It was kind of a Hemingway kind of trip.
In his talk and in a later conversation I had with him, Peter Vronsky examines our conflicted fascination with serial killers, how we find them terrifying and yet gripping. A warning, some parts of this program may be disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised.
December 1979, I get stranded in New York. And I don't have quite enough money to stay comfortably where I wanted to, so I had to have one more night. I had to find some kind of flea bag somewhere to stay in. And so I go out early Sunday morning. I get to the travel inn that looked not too expensive, but not too rough either. And I get to the elevator, punch up, and nothing is happening. There's no elevator coming down, and I could see that it's stopped on the upper floor, the fourth floor. And it probably was maybe 40 seconds, but it seemed like hours I'm waiting. The elevator comes down, door opens, and there is a guy on the elevator. He looked to me like he was in his 30s, looked like a New York office worker on his day off. And the only noticeable things about him was that, one, he had the sheen of sweat on his face. The other was that when the door opened, we did this kind of thing. You're getting on, you're getting off, all right? Except his eyes seemed unfocused. It was like he was looking through me. And in fact, he walked right into me as if I wasn't there, as if I was invisible. And as he walked into me, rather than around me, he bumped me on the shins with, I didn't see what it was, but it was some kind of soft bag that felt to me like he bonked me on the shins with bowling balls, something hard and round. And he's gone. So I figure, okay, I'll go to his floor. And I hit the button for the top floor. The moment I got to the top, as soon as the doors open, I immediately smelt something burning. And I thought, well, you know, it was $55 to stay there. You know, what are you going to get for $55, right? Then I saw down the hallway all this commotion and light smoke traveling along the ceiling of the hallway. I didn't see any flames, but I could see hotel staff banging on people's doors, telling them to get out and stuff. And so I just turned to the emergency stairwell, went down the stairs, got out into the street just as the fire department was arriving. The next day, I go to my destination, which was a film lab. I had to pick up film. And they have all newspapers out in the waiting room, and I read this story.
You left the hotel without knowing what had happened, and so the next morning you're reading the newspapers. What did they say?
Well, the newspaper headline was something like 2 torsos found in burning motel room. I don't remember exactly the headline, but it was clearly the hotel that I had been trying to check into. So it was kind of a revelation as to exactly what that was all about. Of course, it was a kind of very creepy experience. That was kind of the story that I returned home to tell over drinks and dinners to my friends, completely not thinking about the guy that I had run into on the elevator. I didn't realize that I had actually been standing with him in that doorway until about a year later, when I saw his picture in the newspapers.
The killer was a man named Richard Cottingham. I can't imagine what it would have been like when you learned the details of the crime and that you had actually accidentally bumped into him. I'm wondering, can you describe that feeling? What went through you when you realized that a year later?
Well, it was almost a sense that I had a supernatural experience, that I had encountered a monster. I mean, that's the way I described it, that I had bumped into a werewolf-like monsters.
Wow, that is creepy.
Yeah. And so that's what triggered my interest in these creatures, essentially. So I imagined, of course, a monster having committed these kinds of, brutal mutilations. I mean, he beheaded the 2 victims. He chopped their hands off. He had, walked away with the heads and hands in the bag. That added as well, because as he was leaving the elevator, one of the things that annoyed me is that he kind of bonked me with some kind of soft bag he was carrying, like a duffel bag or a bowling ball bag. I never saw it. I just felt it as he was passing me in the elevator doors. So that too kind of creeped me out.
What did they turn out to be?
Top of that, we don't know. He claims that, I've met him and I've spoken with him and am speaking with him right now. And so he tells me that he had already taken the heads out before I would have run into him. And that probably what he bumped me with were kind of the saw and, his kind of toolkit that he would have brought with him.
You say you're still talking to him. Where is he now?
He's in Trenton Penitentiary, Trenton, New Jersey State Prison.
Back in the 1970s, the term serial killer hadn't yet entered the popular lexicon, but it wouldn't be long.
Well, it begins to emerge around May of 1981 when the New York Times uses it to describe Wayne Williams, the Atlanta child murderer.
Wayne Williams will be indicted for even more of the 28 killings that have terrified Atlanta and horrified much of the rest of the world over the past 2 years.
For the first time, we begin to see that construct: serial murderer, serial homicide, serial killing. Prior to that, there were a whole bunch of different words describing it, from, mass killers, which today, of course, are a completely different phenomenon, to recreational killers, sequential killers. People never kind of fit a single term. And of course, this is the moment, the 1970s, that, of course, the FBI profilers, the mine hunters, John Douglas, Robert Ressler, were getting a kind of statistical collection of what serial killers do, their patterns, their behavioral cycles. So we're beginning to get this kind of species of offender now being defined. Their book will be published in 1986. And once that book comes out, Sexual Homicide Patterns and Motives, we realize that there is this category of serial killers, or these several different categories of serial killers, and that they have certain behavioral traits that make them, very different from your average killer or your mass killer. And so we all become familiar through popular entertainment, through true crime literature, with this notion of, what a serial killer is and what we expect of a serial killer.
What would you say were some of the social or historical conditions at the time, that were being addressed by coining the term serial killer?
Well, you're looking at a period, of course, in American history where homicides are dramatically rising overall, including serial murder. So if we look at the record of serial killers in the 20th century, there's approximately maybe 2,250 serial killers identified over that 100-year period. 82% of them will emerge in the last 30 years, between 1970 and 1999.
And why is that?
So that's the big question. Why is that? But it's a question that everybody was asking at that point. Congress even held hearings on that question in the 1980s. It began to be called the serial killer epidemic. I have a theory that maybe challenges the common approach. I mean, the common approach is we were looking for what was it that was happening contemporaneously with these murders. And of course, the 60s and the 70s are these kind of 2 decades. You have the 60s, this revolutionary period where everything, all values, political, familial, social, are being challenged. And of course, there is this incredible era of change and disorder in the United States, in American society. The issue for me is that on average, a serial killer will commit his first murder around the age of 27, 28. That's the statistical average. However, their fantasies begin to develop as early as the age of 5, 6, and 7. And so often you have these, by the time they're adolescents, by the time they're 14, they've kind of sexualized their fantasies, and you have almost kind of a completed formula, an embryonic serial killer at that point who is beginning to test his fantasies out in reality through their adolescence until they come around the age of 27, 28, they cross that line. What that made me realize is that when we're looking at serial killers, the generation of serial killers that are making their appearance in the 1960s and the 1970s, we got to back them up 25 years to 20 years from when they first committed their first murder. And that brings us back to the late 1940s, the post-war era, the Cold War era, the 1950s, 1940s, when this generation of serial killers, the epidemic serial killers, so to speak, were children.
So when you look back, even before that period, have serial killers always existed everywhere, or are they kind of coincidental with Western industrialized societies?
They're not. I found serial killers in the Renaissance period, in rural communities, in urban communities, certainly in the period, in the pre-industrial period. I think why we don't have necessarily much information about those serial killers is 2 reasons. First of all, printed press only emerges in the 1500s, essentially. So we don't have many accounts, like public accounts. Secondly, we don't have really a enforcement agency. I mean, policing is a very new notion. And so justice in the early period of Western civilization often focused on protecting the king's rights, taxation, property, and so forth. Violence, murder, things like that were often settled by families or were settled, in the local community without there being a formal judicial process until you get the witch hunts from about 1440 to 1640. In that period, you get a 200-year period where suddenly Western societies become obsessed with people making pacts with the devil. And so I began to see that suddenly, parallel to the witchcraft trials, we also have these formal trials of werewolves. And the transcripts, many of them had survived. There were early printed pamphlets describing these cases as well. Mm-hmm. And when you read those cases, the things that werewolves are accused of, luring children into their stores or abducting young peasant girls working in the field and mutilating them. When I read those accounts, they were straightforward accounts of what serial killers often do today. And so the only difference was that they were accused of having done what they did in this, again, supernatural state of being a werewolf. So I found there were approximately about one serial killer a year in Renaissance Europe, about the same rate that we had serial killers being brought to justice in industrial society by the 19th century.
After that first run-in with Richard Cottingham, Peter Vronsky set out to learn exactly who the monstrous figure behind the grisly double murder really was.
So my serial killer, Richard Cottingham, doesn't look like a monster, didn't look like a monster, but you're looking at an individual who currently is claiming that he murdered at least 80 women. He was, as I described him as an office worker, was precisely that. He was a computer console operator at Blue Cross Insurance, where he steadily worked at the same job for 14 years. He was paid well. He was married. He had 3 kids who adored him. In the last year of his marriage, his wife sued for divorce because he essentially just stopped coming home. He started to work the late shift. He would get off work at around 10 o'clock, and then he would roam New York City searching out his victims. He's arrested in New Jersey, caught red-handed, torturing a woman in a motel. She was rescued. She'll testify at his trial. So this is one serial killer we know a lot about because several women had actually survived him and described everything he did and how he lured them and so forth. And so he'll be convicted for 3 murders in New York City and 2 murders in New Jersey. He's incarcerated currently in New Jersey. He has a life sentence plus 350 years, all to be done consecutively.
Is there an overall pattern or patterns that we can discern in the way all known serial killers operate?
Well, it's strange that our kind of primal monsters in, again, Western society are, the vampire and the werewolf. And you do have that notion that the FBI used to use, the organized, disorganized serial killer. One is highly organized. We could describe him as almost a preservative serial killer. He'll abduct his victim. He'll attempt to enslave the victim. He will want the victim essentially alive. There is, of course, this sadistic pattern in that. Then you have a kind of destructive serial killer who essentially is just destroying the body of the victim. Often he's a necrophile, so he is completely disassembling the victim. And often those disorganized types, werewolf types of serial killers are acting on a impulse as opposed to constructing a plan based on the fantasy that they're nurturing, kind of a scripted fantasy that they're going to act out upon. So you have these still to this day, essentially, although they you can parse them further, but you have basically the kind of preservative, destructive type of serial killer, or organized, disorganized, as the FBI like to term them. And so each one has certain characteristics that reflect their killing method. And so, for example, the disorganized serial killer is less social, less charming. Often he may not be as physically attractive, say, as compared to Ted Bundy. The disorganized serial killer, the werewolf type serial killer, will often blitz their victim. They will be unable to use a charm to lure the victim into a car, for example. Where the organized serial killer is socialized. Often they'll have a family. They may have a wife and children. That is not highly unusual. They may be gainfully employed. They may have friends. They may be popular in the community in the way, for example, John Wayne Gacy was. I mean, John Wayne Gacy hosts Rosalind Carter, Jimmy Carter's wife, the first lady, in Chicago about 6 months before they find something like 28 corpses buried in the basement of his bungalow. So they have a kind of what we often call the mask of sanity, much more preserved than the kind of disorganized, non-social serial killer that relies on ambushing a victim and just coming through their door, or hitting them over the head, or bludgeoning them and dragging them away.
Now, I know that Richard Cottingham was the first serial killer you encountered or came across, who kind of sparked the interest to begin with. But you could have written a book about any number of serial killers. What was it about him that compelled you to write a book about him? He's
the one I first met. He's the one who essentially made me realize that such a thing existed. I had no interest. I didn't read much true crime, or I wasn't interested in true crime. So this personal experience kind of interested me. And of course, I was interested in the case as it progressed. And I often wondered about the victim and how their path, in particular, one woman was identified, Dida Godarzi, an Iranian national young woman, 23 years old. She was identified just by luck by the shoes that she had worn. They were sold in very few stores in New Jersey. And she had a cesarean birth scar. And so the police began to narrow down the search for women reported missing with a cesarean, who might have had a cesarean birth. And that's how they identified her. And she had apparently had a girl that she had given up because of her lifestyle for adoption. And I was left often wondering, what happened to the girl? Did she disappear in kind of New Jersey's adoption system into some horror story? And did she know her origins, the story of what happened to her mother? And I suddenly get a call, and it was Dida Godarzi's daughter, Jennifer Weiss. And so she phoned me, introduced herself. She said that she was on the quest looking for her mother's head that had never been found. She wanted to find the severed head and reunite it with her mother's torso. And that in order to do this, she had befriended Richard Cottingham, and that she was visiting him in prison. And she was having a problem extracting a narrative from him that made sense. Cottingham is 73 years old. His mind wanders. His memory is not the best. And so she kind of needed a historian who can break down chronologically what he was saying, and was aware also of that era. And so she offered, she said, if I would help her, she would introduce me to Richard Cottingham, and maybe if I want to do something, and interview him for myself. And so 2 years ago, that's how I was finally, after, nearly 40 years, introduced to Richard Cottingham.
Let Let me ask you this. How often or how unique was it for a family member to seek answers in this way about victims who are related to them?
Well, certainly the way Jennifer Weiss has done it is certainly unique because she came in a very non-confrontational way. She kind of came in a forgiving way, trying to elicit from him some sense of remorse. I mean, he doesn't feel remorse, but he has a cognitive understanding of what it is. And, you know, we have this thing about psychopathy where the kind of compulsions of psychopaths, their obsessions, they begin to fade once they reach their 50s. It could be with some kind of connection to a decline in testosterone. We don't know. But they seem to be less, as I say, compulsively driven once they reach that age.
You know, our understanding of serial killers is often based more on legend, but is really short on facts. And my understanding is that the statistics we have collected are collected by Radford University in the US, and that they're really based on media, press accounts. Just a quick sense of why has there been such little study done on this specific population?
Well, because you need access to data. And of course, what we're talking here is about police data, essentially. And so most prosecutions in the United States take place on a county level. So you have thousands of counties, thousands of different jurisdictions that have different rules about what kind of material they'll make accessible. In general, investigative files, even if a case is closed, are not accessible to researchers, let alone the public. And so trial transcripts are these kind of very formal types of processes that often you don't get the kind of information that a historian or a criminologist might want. And so the only kind of collection of data that one can make is if he or she goes into a prison environment and begins to interview a serial killer. And even there, you're limited by what the serial killer is telling you, what they're revealing to you. Mm-hmm. So the only kind of broad data that we have is what is reported in the newspapers, essentially.
While there was a dearth of academic research on the serial killer population throughout history, in the 1970s, there was no shortage of media, especially magazines, that portrayed and even glorified some of the violent behaviors that serial killers were actually carrying out in real life.
There were all these genres of over-the-counter magazines, conventional magazines, mainstream magazines. One genre was the so-called sweats, men's adventure magazines. And they were called the sweats because they used this type of paint that simulated the victims sweating in agony and the torturers as well. These would be sold in supermarkets, they would be sold on newsstands, in the drugstore. This was not under-the-counter material. And of course, they're all celebrating this mutilation, torture, and rape of female victims. Anywhere men gathered, barber shops, mechanics, waiting room, you would see these magazines. The other genre were true detective magazines, and this is something the FBI in particular wrote about as genre of material that is being frequently found in serial killers' possessions after their arrest, and serial killers themselves report being obsessed with this literature. The covers, again, are often very similar, except rather than being painted, these covers were photographs with models. And in fact, we have one serial killer in the 1950s who would abduct women and pose them in his own version of true detective magazine covers before he killed them, Harvey Glattman. Very often, the model is gazing towards the buyer of the magazine. The message essentially is that for 50 cents, she's yours. So there begins this kind of immediate, kind of this psychological connection between the consumer of this magazine and the victim portrayed in it. They're looking at each other. And there's yet a third genre which begins to emerge in the late 60s, 70s, and that's a very pornographic series of bondage magazines. That these would be sold in adult stores. They're not sold in the supermarket, but they were just explicit murder material, essentially. And so you have a generation of kids to adolescents to young men who, some of them have been essentially brought up on these magazines. So, and again, it's a national phenomenon and North American one.
So in your lecture, you imply that there may be a causal link between, the sweats that you describe and serial killings that target women. Is there convincing evidence to support that implication?
Well, the evidence, what we have is, I guess we can say it's anecdotal because no one has done a statistical study, but increasingly we're beginning to see in the 50s and 60s, as serial killers are being apprehended, this literature in their possession. We begin to see that what they do is often scripted on the basis of what is depicted. In the same way as, Jack the Ripper fantasies were scripted by a type of pornography that was appearing in 19th century Britain in the time of the kind of Victorian oppression, where pornography became more violent.
And you also talk about New York in the 70s kind of being this dark, and often kind of dangerous place. And yet we know, obviously, that serial killers turn up in not so dark places.
It's a serial killer, alleged serial killer.
The investigation into Bruce McArthur is unprecedented.
We've never seen anything quite like this.
Unimaginable.
The bodies are from large planters.
Unrelenting.
I would say it's going to go into the years.
We saw Bruce McArthur in Toronto, basically downtown. And before him, Robert Pickton in BC. Is there a sense in which the dark and gritty New York of the 1970s perpetuates some kind of dark romance media culture has of the serial killer?
There's some kind of nostalgia for that era of New York, when New York was, dirty old New York. I mean, there's even a Facebook page, Dirty Old New York, that celebrates New York of the 70s. There was this sense that the law no longer prevailed, that anything was available, anything was allowed, anything was possible. And certainly a personality, a hedonistic personality like Cottingham thrived on what New York was, in that period.
While researchers have tried to study just how serial killers choose their victims, popular literature like The Sweats almost always depicted them as female. But according to Peter Vronsky, reality paints a very different picture.
When you crunch all the numbers, females make up about 53% of victims, much less than we thought. Serial killing is an equal opportunity crime when it comes to gender. And of course, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Bruce McArthur, they targeted exclusively males. And there are female serial killers. Approximately 1 in every 6 serial killers is actually a woman. And 50% of them have killed either another woman or a child. We have this kind of mythological concept of the Black Widow that seduces her husband or her boyfriend and kills him for profit. Yes, there is a very small segment of serial killers that are like that. The rest of them are killing for the same reason that the men are killing: power and control.
Why are we so fixated with this idea or image of women as the victims of serial killers? Where and when does that idea originate?
It's women and children, essentially. And I think it goes back to when the first serial killers were appearing, where they would have to physically overcome their victim. And certainly, the medieval world, the Renaissance world was much more violent than today. And so women and children are more vulnerable. And so it makes, just strategically, constructively, it is easier to overcome a child victim and a female victim, along with everything that children and females represent to a personality that feels themselves somehow, an underclass, or, as I say, low self-esteem, low sense of self-worth.
But when we look at the idea, I mean, the victims aren't always exclusively women and children.
No, they're not. But when they are males, there's either a materialistic component in it, or there is a sexual component in it. So gay serial killers will kill, gay male victims. So that's often where, a lot of male victims are either victims of female serial killers, of which there are more than we acknowledge, or they are victims of gay serial killers, or you have that category. I mean, you have about 5 categories of serial killers ranging, from sexual serial killers to materialistic serial killers who are just killing for profit, one victim after another. And so gender often is not an issue there. It's, material worth and profit. You have missionary serial killers who are on a mission to eliminate a certain type of person, say abortion doctor snipers, who will, target that category of victim. And then you have visionary serial killers who are legally insane. They don't know what they're doing. They're suffering from visions.
I wonder if you could speak to any specific conditions that you've observed, economic, social, that would have helped, create a serial killer personality.
The most common thing is familial breakdown. The majority of serial killers by the age of 14 are in a single parent family, usually the absence of a father. Trauma, sexual abuse in childhood, witnessing violence in the family, loneliness, rejection by peers in childhood. That's another big common factor.
You're listening to Ideas, featuring author and historian Peter Vronsky. Our conversation is based on a 2019 lecture he gave at Ryerson University entitled Serial Homicide, A Global Perspective. Ideas can be heard on CBC Radio 1 in Canada, on Sirius XM in North America, in Australia on RN, and around the world at cbc.ca/ideas. You can also get our podcast on the CBC Listen app or wherever you find your podcasts. I'm Nala Ayed.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brian Goldman. If you haven't heard my new podcast, The Dose, this is the perfect time to subscribe. Each week we answer your most pressing health-related questions. And right now, we know you're grappling with COVID-19. On The Dose, we bring in top experts to answer your questions about the coronavirus and post some of our own. Get the latest evidence in a way that's easy to understand by subscribing to The Dose. It's your guide to getting through this difficult time. You can find The Dose wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Keith MacArthur. Unlocking Bryson's Brain is a podcast about my son,
Hi, Brad.
the rare disease that keeps him from walking or talking.
I mean, Bryson's perfect, but his life is really hard.
And our family's search for a cure.
Oh my gosh, maybe science is ready for this.
It's part memoir, part medical mystery.
We can do just about anything.
Modifying DNA.
My heart in my throat.
Cure is controversial.
Unlocking Bryson's Brain. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
11 years after coming face-to-face with a serial killer totally by happenstance in New York City, Peter Vronsky would run into a second serial killer, just as randomly and unexpectedly, this time in Moscow, where he was producing a film.
One day, our crew comes onto this scene just off the Red Square where people had built a tent city, protesters. Most of them were traumatized victims from the Gulag era. We wander around through this area and start speaking to some of the people and interviewing them. The horrendous stories. And at one moment, we notice that there's a guy sitting there with a little booth and old Russian flags, and as soon as he sees us, he comes running up, and he wants to be interviewed. He's got a story. At first he tries in English, but it breaks down. I speak Russian, so I was able to converse with him in Russian. And he tells me now this story, how he has come from south of Russia, Ukraine, to meet with Gorbachev. He's protesting that the Azeri mafia is building toilets underneath his windows. And Gorbachev is going to put all this in place for him. He spoke for a bit and then said thank you and went off on our way. What, of course, I had no way of knowing was that about 3 weeks later, he's arrested back home, Rostov-on-the-Don. He's arrested after committing his 51st, 52nd, and 53rd murder. I had just encountered what at that time was the most prolific serial killer in history up until then. 53 victims. He cannibalized them, tore them to pieces. In fact, what I remembered about him was not his face. What I remembered were those glasses, because as he was speaking, he got all excited, and his glasses fogged up from the inside of his glasses. And decades later, he'd come to me in my dreams, like in my nightmares, like this geek with foggy glasses. But I had no idea. The other thing I remembered was the knot of his tie. He was out of place. He looked like a school teacher, which for a time he was, until he was caught victimizing some of his students and fired. By the time he's brought to trial, and I'm in Russia at that time still, and I'm watching it on television, I don't recognize the guy. I had no idea that was the guy I had turned away from an interview at that time, as I kick myself to this day. I could have had an interview, although it wasn't about serial killing that he wanted to talk about. He looked completely mad. It's only later, when I started contemplating maybe writing a book about the history of serial homicide, and I thought, well, this is one guy I should include in the book. And looking into the various sources of the investigation, I come across this story, how he's suspected of several murders in Moscow, and that the reason he was there was he was protesting in that tent about the Azeri mafia building a toilet underneath his window, and that I remembered. And I suddenly realized that, my God, I've just encountered a second serial killer, and like the first, I didn't know it.
You don't mention his name, but in this second encounter, you're talking about Andrei Chikatilo, who, as you mention in your talk, murdered and mutilated 53 women and children. But most people outside of Russia have likely never heard of him. Can I get you to sketch out the basics of his story?
He grew up in the pre-war period in the 1930s during the famine in the Ukraine, during the Second World War as a child. So he was very well educated. He was a school teacher for a while. And of course, there began to be issues with students as there were accusations that he had molested students. He then became, would be called in Russia, a functionary, an apparatchik in a factory. He began essentially murdering boys, girls, and women at random, mutilating them. He was kind of like the werewolf serial killer often. And that's yes. Chikatilo's story. He's kind of the first. And in his time, of course, 53 victims was the most that any serial killer had been convicted for. So he was kind of, in that period, the record holder, if you want to use that term again. And
speaking of records, you've encountered 2 serial killers that you know of, that you know of. I'm wondering how likely is it actually that the average person has encountered?
That's the $1,000 question, right? I kind of wrote in my first book that the only difference between me and you is that I know who my serial killers were. I mean, the Jimmy Carter administration was rife with serial killers. You had Rosalind Carter was being hosted by John Wayne Gacy. Walter Mondale, the vice president, Jeffrey Dahmer, managed to secure secure on a school trip to Washington a visit with Vice President Mondale for him and his fellow classmates as a prank. Deborah Harry claims that she was picked up by Ted Bundy when she was hitchhiking. So I began to collecting all these stories of people who had encountered serial killers, and my stories became kind of lame compared to them.
So can we conclude from that there are perhaps more out there than we think?
We can. We don't really know how many are there, so to say more. We only have estimates. The kind of conservative estimate is that there may be around 30 serial killers out there. That's the conservative. The more liberal estimate is that there may be as many as 300, but 30 might be a possibility. It's a question of linkage. Linkage is an issue, as we saw here in the MacArthur murder. There was a suspicion that they were linked, but there was no solid evidence they were. And police departments, even to this day, because of the rarity of serial killers, often will go in that direction last.
How many do we know of in Canada?
Altogether in Canadian history, we've had at least 100. In fact, statistically, Canada, I think, was like the second or third. And again, that's the Radford study in terms of how many serial homicides we have. We're very prolific Canadian serial killers.
Wow.
And we've had unique ones, from Colonel Williams, which baffles us to this day. I mean, I can't find another serial killer anywhere in the history of the world like that, who begins killing at such a late age and has this kind of distinguished career as a military officer and so forth.
So I wanted to go back to the idea of the role of the media and how we talk about them in society. You point out that the public has this unending appetite for stories about serial killers, that we build mythologies around them, whether it's real ones like Jack the Ripper or sort of fictional ones like the Joker. Why do you think there is this obsession? Why does it exist?
Well, there are anti-heroes in a way. They challenge the norms of society. They're the rebels. One of the films that really projected the serial killer into a figure of this kind of counterculture anti-hero, of course, was Silence of the Lambs. Jodie Foster as FBI agent Starling was not the star of that movie. It was Hannibal Lecter, the charming serial killer.
That is the Duomo scene from the Belvedere.
You know, Florence?
All that detail just from memory, sir?
Memory, Agent Starling, is what I have instead of a view.
Seven, for example, celebrates the brilliance of the serial killer who is killing through, the allegory of seven sins.
We see a deadly sin on every street corner, in every home, and we tolerate it. We tolerate it because it's coming. It's trivial. We tolerate it morning, noon, and night. Well, not anymore. I'm setting the example. And what I've done is going to be puzzled over and studied and followed.
And so we begin to get in the 80s and the 90s these kinds of science fiction portrayals of super genius serial killers who we admire for their ability to elude justice. And in fact, most serial killers are of average intelligence or below average intelligence. There's very few highly intelligent serial killers. But
sometimes this obsession that you're talking about develops into something deeper, like in a sort of almost a romantic feeling, on the part of some people for these killers. From your research, what are the factors that can drive that type of attraction?
I mean, we have a term for it, hibistrophilia, an attraction to violent individual. We're talking about female admirers of male serial killers. We may have, perhaps, like a Karla Homolka, a damaged young woman who is somehow under-socialized and is seeking out the strongest male that she can find to mate with. And of course, what is stronger than a murdering, raping serial killer? So that's one theory. There's also a theory that some women are seeking out to save the bad boy serial killer, to reform them, that the power of love will conquer all and that there's still a chance to redeem the serial killer. I looked at Durant, a serial killer in the 1890s in San Francisco, and he had he was a handsome medical student. In fact, he was from Toronto, but he ended up studying medicine in San Francisco. He was a necrophile. He murdered 2 women in a church, kept their bodies there until they were found. But he was a good-looking young medical student. And during his trial, there was, for example, a young woman that would come and give him flowers every day at the trial. So that's a phenomenon.
That's disturbing.
100 years ago it was there.
Very disturbing. You've written 3 books about serial killers and you lecture about them. Is there a sense for you at all that your own work and even perhaps this conversation is contributing to the sensationalism around them?
I try not to look at it in a sensational way. There's all sorts of genres. There is this kind of celebration of serial killers, and I don't think anything in my books celebrates what they do. I think I'm very careful in terms of the victims. I try to look at it as a historical phenomena coldly. No more than a book on a battle in the Second World War is sensationalizing war.
Mm-hmm. Is there any evidence, as far as you know, that the attention we as media give to serial killers somehow encourages others to become one as well?
Oh, of course, as much as there's evidence that the Bible does. Yes, there are some serial killers that are inspired by what they read in the media, as they are inspired by what they read in the Bible. So everything inspires serial killers, potentially. And as I say, it's never one thing. So, if we banned media, if we banned the Bible, if we banned all literature, there would still be serial killers. They would just probably script their murders in a different way. They would take their inspiration from something else. Following the Second World War, there was a tendency, just like in Jack the Ripper's era of England, to repress certain things, and one of the things that was repressed was the trauma of the fathers who were bringing up these generation of serial killers. Out of 900,000 soldiers that went to war, something like 37% were discharged as neuropsychiatric casualties. Mm-hmm. All these guys were then bringing up children. And so as I began to look at that generation of serial killers, there were all these accounts of their fathers coming home and just remaining in kind of sullen silence, fathers eventually just abandoning the family. One of the other factors that you often see as well in serial killer biographies is a very strong mother figure. And certainly women in the Second World War were very much empowered by the virtue of what they had to do in the absence of many males on the battlefield. You have this case of, one serial killer whose mother was already a very powerful figure even prior to marrying a World War II officer who then came back from the war completely burnt out. She somehow faulted her son with that, and so it's the mother that becomes the abusive figure in this. Sure enough, after killing 11 young women, this serial killer then killed his mother finally, in the realization that that's who he always had wanted to kill since he was a kid. So these factors, war, instability, God only knows after this COVID period what we're going to be facing 15 years down the line as kids who are undergoing this kind of trauma today are growing up. The problem essentially is this, though, what challenges all of us in terms of serial killers, is that lots of kids have the same trauma in their childhoods. They don't become serial killers. So the issue here is despite all the studies we've done, and we've been now systematically analyzing serial killers since the FBI began to really look at that phenomenon in the late 1970s. And study after study, we have not yet isolated that one single X factor that, one child undergoes all this trauma and yet becomes a functioning citizen, non-criminal, another becomes a serial killer. What is the X factor? Perhaps old school biblical evil. It's a little bit too early for us just to discount this idea that there is something that's called evil, and maybe one day we'll be able to identify it, but right now, we don't know.
Peter Vronsky is an author and investigative historian at Ryerson University. He's also an expert in the history of serial homicide around the world. Audio excerpts from this episode are from a lecture Vronsky gave at Ryerson University in November of 2019, called Serial Homicide, A Global Perspective. This episode was produced by Tayo Barrow. Lisa Ayuso is our web producer. Danielle Duval is our technical producer. The senior producer, Nicola Luksic. The executive producer of Ideas is Greg Kelly, and I'm Nala Ayed.
For more CBC